The playoffs have officially commenced. We are halfway to determining the top 4 teams of the 2020 Overwatch League season. What surprises were in store for us? There were plenty, and that's all coming up on today's Owl's Nest. Welcome back to all of our regulars, and hello to any new viewers out there. If this happens to be your first time visiting the Owl's Nest, make sure you hit the subscribe button and like this video. If you turn on the bell for notifications, leave us some comments about how much you like the show. So let's dig right in here today. Of course, we are halfway done now with the playoffs. Some teams have been sent home. Some teams have been sent to the losers bracket. Brackets all over the place have been busted. But before we start to get into the results and what we can come to expect from some of the teams, I actually want to start with where the meta currently stands. We seem to have done a complete 180. Shield tanks are almost nowhere to be seen. We've seen the return of Hog. We've seen the return of D.Va. Zarya's back in the mix. So Jake, where I'd like to start is with the tank game. Talk to me a little bit about what we saw this weekend or this past weekend, and what does it mean for the meta going forward?
Well, I think while there are still some teams, notably the Washington Justice, locking in the Zarya Hog and making it work, getting wins out of it, I do think that most teams have actually gone towards the Winston D.Va, at least at the top end. That seems to be the strongest composition. Occasionally Rein D.Va on certain maps, or Rein Zarya even. But the Winston D.Va seems to be the dominant style right now. Just those fast dive tanks, let it engage really quickly, follow up with any momentary weakness of the other team, just being out of position, getting caught off. So that is sort of what I expected coming into this meta, was that it would ultimately turn into a dive meta. But nonetheless, I think this is an interesting variant of it, especially as we look further into the rest of the lineups. The DPS, the supports, very unique. Not comps we've seen a whole lot in the past.
So obviously, right out the gate, we did see a lot of the Hog and D.Va, and as you said, since a lot of dive, there was a lot of Winston, some Zarya thrown in there as well. We did still see a little bit of shield play. I saw Reinhardt here, a Sigma here. What place do you think that has in the meta?
Well, I think, especially a hero like Reinhardt, on certain maps where Winston struggles, where there's not great, positioning for Winston to play, doesn't have great initiation angles, then sometimes Rein is just better as just a default pick. We saw that in SF Shock versus the Atlanta Reign when on Havana, both teams switched to a Rein comp and just played the Rein mirror on that map, with pretty much everything else being relatively consistent in terms of their strategy. So I think Rein definitely has a place. Although it definitely is a niche place, right? Winston is a lot more flexible, and on most of the maps in the game, you can get more value out of Winston. Not to say all, but I would say most is a fair assessment there. So I think, Sigma especially, though, definitely still has a place in more poking style compositions. But the problem with Sigma is I think he is particularly weak against full dive styles. That's probably the biggest counter to Sigma, is just running past his shield. Getting behind him so he can't really use the kinetic grasp very safely. So I think fundamentally, Sigma's in a worse spot than Rein in just the sense of not his hero strength really, but his place in the meta is pretty questionable, I'd say.
So speaking of hero strengths then, of course, when it comes to some of the flashiest, some of the most fun heroes to watch are DPS heroes. What were some of the big trends that you saw this weekend from the winning teams, and do you expect that to continue going forward?
Well, for one, I think Sombra has been a huge part of the meta, which is no real surprise, I guess, with Roadhog being played and feeding away a lot of EMP to Sombra. It's a great pick. Hack being a great counter to Roadhog. Just Sombra in general, and pretty much any comp, it seems like it works. You can get a ton of value off the EMP, especially when you're playing these very fast dive styles. Then you have natural follow up for EMP. Makes a ton of sense, and that's why pretty much everyone is running Sombra. Outside of the Sombra, when teams are playing these rush styles with dive, we've seen pretty much exclusively Reaper and Tracer alongside that Sombra. I think the Reaper is a dominant choice against certain slower tank styles, but when you're playing into a team that is trying to run the Mercy boosted Ashe, trying to commit to I would say a little bit of an older style, look at the Justice, right? That's what they've been doing with the Roadhog, is consistently running the Mercy and the Ashe as well. So a team that tries to get away with those sort of greedy picks, then I think the Tracer is a better answer. So you can run that Tracer Sombra with both dive tanks, and you have a lot of catching potential. So you can kill off heroes like Mercy, like Ashe, that need to stay alive for a
So the only other question DPS related that I had is we actually did see a little bit of even Pharah being played over the weekend as well. Some teams utilizing it a lot better than other teams. Outlaws. What are your thoughts on the Pharah pick in this sort of meta that we've been seeing here?
I think Pharah can work if you're going to be playing this Roadhog style, but I do feel it's a bit hamstrung because with heroes like Ana, Diva, and Ashe, pretty much all being comfortable, strong meta picks. Like you're not going out on a limb to pick these heroes. Then Pharah is in a bit of a rough spot, in my opinion, just because not that she's weak, but really just her natural predators are strong. And if you're already wanting to play those natural predators to Pharah, then do you really want to play Pharah? I think sometimes yes, but I think in other cases it's just not worth it. I think it's also a hero that really depends heavily on those matchups. Like if you're in a certain match where the enemy team's best players are not those roles, then you might be more comfortable forcing it and getting away with it. But you don't really want to be, I think, enabling the enemy team's Diva and Ashe in that way. If those are players you're worried about, if they're very strong players in the opposing team, then I don't think the Pharah pick makes the most sense, because it really is just a skill tester for those opponents. You know, can they hit all the shots while you're in the air? Can they, can the Diva disrupt you at the perfect moment? And if those are players you're really worried about from a skill perspective, then it's pretty risky to pick Pharah.
All right, so before we start getting into talking about some of the top teams and what we expect out of them over these next few weeks, of course, I don't want to leave out the support when it comes to this meta. How's the support meta looking, and what heroes have been favored, alongside some of these dive comps?
Right now, to me, it looks like there's really just two comps that, well, maybe slightly more than two, but there's the one comp, which is the Lucio Moira, which generally is unchanging if you're going to play those heroes. Generally, you're going to play the very fast dive style, and that's the Tracer/Reaper plus Sombra and the Winston Diva. Just full dive. Every player on your team is going to go into the fight, and for better or for worse, the fight will end very quickly. That's the goal of that style. You can take some rotations, you can get a little bit fancy with it, but ultimately your goal is to just jump on the enemy, catch them off guard, and kill them quickly. And that style, to me, looks pretty great. Like the Lucio Moira style, especially if you're going to run it with a Reaper, makes a ton of sense to me. In the past, I've been critical of Moira in the dive style because it's not efficient at healing a hero like Tracer. But Reaper really changes that game because he wants to play that frontline role. He wants to stack up with the tanks and get those big AoE heals from Moira. So I think that comp makes a lot of sense, especially with the Reaper. And the adjustment from Reaper to Tracer isn't so bad because you really only make that switch in order to counter the very greedy styles like Mercy and Ashe. And speaking of those greedy styles, the other opportunity, instead of running the very aggressive supports Lucio Moira, you can run very defensive supports in Mercy Ana, is typically what we've seen. Which is just, I think the idea of that comp is Nano Boost is insanely valuable for tanks like Roadhog and Zarya, who both have some trouble staying alive when they get caught and surrounded. So the Nano can kind of change that and allow them to fight their way out of dangerous circumstances. And then, of course, Mercy, with her res, with her damage boost, is the perfect greedy hero to support a pick like Ashe, help you try and burn down those divers before they can cross the space. Both those comps seem pretty viable. I think the Merciana, especially good if there's a lot of Roadhog in the game. So if you're in your ranked games, then everyone's playing Roadhog. I would say stick to the Merciana. But for teams that want to play a faster, more coordinated style, then the Lucio Moira is dominant.
All right, so getting into some of these teams now, what we've been seeing over this past weekend, what we can expect going forward is let's get the big one out of the way, the elephant in the room here. The Washington Justice seem to have this trend of really coming alive at the end of a season. Who are these guys, and what have they done with the Justice?
Well, I wonder how much it's a trend for the Justice and the franchise as much as it's just the power of adding in a player like Decay and playing a style that puts Decay front and center, that makes him the player to beat. I think fundamentally what Justice have said with the style they're playing is you have to beat Decay Zarya or you can't beat us. Like, we're going to put Decay on this super enabled carry hero that is Zarya is the most true carry hero in the game, right? You actually always want to be the last alive. You always want to be that one player who the enemy just can't get through, and you just end up cleaving through everybody as they come back to the fight. So I think putting Decay on Zarya ultimately looks like a really wise choice. Seems like the rest of the team is feeling the momentum boost from having a superstar like Decay. And ultimately, I think it'll be interesting to see how far they can go with that style. I think there are some limits to it. And they are one of the few teams, at least in NA, that is really locking in that Hog Zarya style. So I wonder, as they face stronger and stronger opponents, will those opponents be ready to counter them? In particular, I think Paris fell to them by playing the Reaper Sombra. And I think Paris...
3-0 as well.
Yeah, I think Paris, though, they just missed the critical adjustment of playing Tracer in that comp instead. I think they should not have played a Reaper into this greedy style, because the way they win would be catching off the Mercy and the Ashe. And actually, the pressure on the Roadhog is not really significant from Reaper, because Roadhog can just one-shot the Reaper. So I think a Tracer would have been a better choice just to attack the backline. I think the irony of Decay and Janu on these very aggressive tank rolls is that the way to beat them is to actually ignore them, in my opinion, and move all the way past them, catch the backline off, and then come back to kill the tanks when they're the only players alive and they have no sustain. And I think that I'm really curious to see, as they face tougher and tougher teams with the style, will those teams make that adjustment? Teams like the Shock going forward.
Well, we saw them because they were sent to the losers bracket by the Shock, going all the way to a Game 5 as well. I mean, do you think going forward, obviously they go up against the Los Angeles Valiant next, who got knocked down to the lower bracket by the Fusion, but beat the Mayhem in Game 5 as well. So in the Justice versus the Valiant matchup, do you think the Valiant might have what it takes to be able to break Decay and his Zarya?
Well, I think for Valiant, I think Shock has done the hardest part of the work for them, in the sense of showing like the adjustments needed over the course of a series, right? To go down 2-0, like you can see what Shock did wrong in that series. You can see what they've changed. You can see what they started to do right, to actually come back and get that map 5 victory, stay in the upper bracket, right? So since Shock have already accomplished that against the Justice strategy, I think it's very possible that the Valiant can follow suit just by learning a lot from that match. And I think for Justice, I think it's going to be a lot harder to change anything than it will be for other teams to adapt to them, just because with this Hog Zarya style, I think you are quite committed. I'm not sure what other options you really have when you're playing this comp, in terms of like what heroes you can switch. I think you basically need to play the whole strat, kit and caboodle, or it kind of falls apart. You have some serious flaws without this damage boosted Ashe, or changing one of the tanks doesn't seem to make a ton of sense to me, especially if you're going to play Decay and Janu, like double off tank players. So I think it could definitely be winnable for the Valiant, but the Justice, their comp is like extremely skill heavy. So if you just pop off on game day for the Justice, like they might still be able to get away with the wins, regardless of the strategy being understood potentially by the Valiant.
All right, so looking at where the losers bracket is currently, we have the Atlanta Reign, the Florida Mayhem, and then the Valiant and the Justice. Who's your vote? Who's your pick out of those teams to potentially go ahead forward? Obviously, they will be facing either the Fusion or the Shock, depending on how that match goes. But of those 4 teams, who do you think makes it out?
I think my bet would have to be the Florida Mayhem, I think, which is maybe a bit weird, but I do think Florida can beat, for one, Atlanta, because I think Atlanta should have been at their best, in my opinion, playing this brawl comp. That should have been their comfort zone, because that's what they've tried to play all season long, regardless of the meta. And for Shock to beat them, I would say very dominantly in that mirror match. The only map Shock lost in their series was when Shock tries to play the Hog Zarya into Reaper Sombra and just gets destroyed. But as soon as they went back to just mirror matching, then they beat Reign, on the other 3 maps playing mirror match. And we're just a consistently better team in the mirror. I wonder now about Reign, like how good are they really at this brawl style? And now that they've had a big hit to their momentum, I think a team like Mayhem is just going to be super motivated, considering they've had good success this season, and it's like a franchise first for the squad. So I'm sure they all really want to keep it going, and I wonder if Reign is going to be able to stand up to that.
All right, well, taking a break from the NA and going over to the APAC region now. The teams that we still have alive, of course, the Shanghai Dragons and the Seoul Dynasty up in the winners bracket, and then we have the Guangzhou Charge and the New York Excelsior sitting currently down in the losers bracket. So currently, what's your take on what happened in the APAC region? Was it a big change from what we were seeing in North America?
Well, we saw some differences in terms of preferences. We saw notably a lot more wrecking ball. Not just from the Chengdu Hunters, but from other teams as well. Although it seems like clearly the Hunters are the originators of that style. We've seen more consistent dive play. I would say fewer teams are like compared to NA, where a lot of the teams try to play the Roadhog. I don't think we've seen too much of it. Only in like on a case-by-case basis, I would say in APAC, for teams finding those optimal styles for it. But I think when it comes to this dive mirror, the game is just extremely coordination intensive, and there's a lot less potential for an individual to, sort of pop off and carry. So teams that are relying on enabling a superstar, I think are going to find themselves in a tougher spot, and teams that have relied on their coordination and fundamentals are going to be rewarded for that in this meta.
So 4 teams left in the APAC region. Who are the 2 that we should expect to make their way out of this and head to the grand finals?
Well, I think Seoul has been resurgent, and that has, I think, been the wrench in the works here as far as making any sort of prediction, because I think Dragons, you have to think that they're going to be one of the top 2 teams. I mean, probably going to be the 1 seed. Like, the Dragons just been so sick all season long, showing absolutely no signs of slowing down in this meta. They look pretty insane, especially playing that Tracer Sombra comp with the Rush style. They look really, really good at that. So I think that'll carry them pretty far. I think they're almost certainly going to qualify. But beyond that, I really think it's anybody's game. I think any of the other 3 teams could be the second qualifier. Based on this meta, based on this comp, I think all these teams can be good at it. Seoul is the biggest surprise to me, but obviously you can't question them. They're still in the winner's bracket. I do think it'll be pretty tough for them to beat Seoul or to beat Shanghai. But as far as going forward, facing the winner of the losers bracket match, I have no idea who's going to win that, much less who will beat or whether they can beat Seoul. Assuming Seoul is, of course, the opponent in that match. But yeah, I really think it's anybody's game. I don't think there's any meat at all in a prediction, because I think both teams are going to be very good at that style, at the fast-paced brawl style. You've got a player like Mono leading New York Excelsior, players like Sabiolbi, the clutch factor, and then on the other side for the charge, Eileen, Nero, and Happy, I think make a great triplet. Although for charge, maybe it'll be a bit of an Achilles heel that Happy isn't going to be able to play nearly as much of the backline hit scan as he has all season long. And I think he's really been a real bright spot for them, a real leader for them in terms of game impact. So I think for charge, maybe their stock is hit the most, and they might be the team, despite having a great performance and looking really strong this season. I think maybe they'll be the team to go down to New York.
Well, as a fan, I think this is the best place for us to be in, where there are so many different teams right now that have what it takes to potentially make it through to those finals. That's going to be it for us today, guys. Thanks for watching the Owl's Nest. Before you go, make sure to click that bell to subscribe to our channel, get all the notifications on the latest videos. And make sure that you catch the only show all about collegiate esports, CheckpointXP on campus. The players, the schools, and the competitions. Watch right here on our YouTube channel, or download and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure that you're following Jake at JakeOW on Twitter and Jake_OW on Twitch and YouTube. And until next time, guys, stay on that payload.